Hello everybody. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Collaborative Domestic Solution Center, Driving Client Value Through an Onshore Delivery Capability. My name is David Goodstein and I'm a webinar coordinator for the Outsourcing Institute. It is our pleasure to be the co-host of today's event with Collaborative Consulting. Before we begin today's session, I'd like to quickly tell you about the questions box you can use throughout today's session. We encourage you to submit your question to today's speakers. To do so, please click on the question box, type your question in the space provided, and click the Submit button. Today's webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a follow-up email tomorrow with the link to the recorded webinar and presentation slides. Presentation slides and video will also be available at outsourcing.com. So before we begin, I'd like to quickly tell you about the Outsourcing Institute for those who aren't familiar with us. The Outsourcing Institute is a professional association dedicated to providing independent best practices, tools, roadshow events, and networking opportunities for all forms of outsourcing. Located at outsourcing.com, we have 70,000 members globally. OI specializes in providing low-cost and no-cost alternatives for outsourcing buyers in need of RFP tools, vendor selection assistance, training, as well as general support and coaching. For those of you who are in this market, we offer an array of very targeted sponsorship and promotional opportunities. Our sister company, CMS, provides recruiting services for those seeking to hire outsourced professionals experienced at buying, selling, managing, or consulting in this arena. Our contact information is at the bottom of the screen for those who have any questions. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to our moderator, John Butler, Principal at ISG.
Thanks, David, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. Hi, I'm John Butler. I'm with Information Services Group, the leading sourcing advisory firm in the industry. And today we have the pleasure of joining me on the phone. And I don't know, David, if you can advance the slide here. Scott Rosa, who is the Director of eBusiness from Analog Devices. And Scott is also a client of Collaborative Consulting. In addition, we have John Williams, Senior Vice President of Services, who is really going to explain the notion of just what this hybrid onshore model is and how it works. And then we'll also be joined by Arun Khond, who is a Senior Principal with Collaborative. And Arun is going to take us on a deep dive case study so you can all see the effects of how this model actually works. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Our overview for today is really, John's going to talk to us just what is this new hybrid onshore model, what are the benefits, where does it apply best, what are the key success criteria for both client and provider, and what to look for in a provider. So with that said, John, why don't you explain to everybody on the phone just what is this new model you guys at Collaborative have cooked up here?
Sure, John. Thank you very much for the introduction, and we certainly appreciate having the opportunity to speak to the audience about this what we believe relatively new model in the marketplace, although it's based on a lot of fundamental tenets of existing models. So really this hybrid onshore model is a service delivery model that takes into account the fact that oftentimes proximity matters. So how close you are to the client or the service receiver, how close teams are together from a logical perspective, maybe not so much a physical, does matter in certain types of complex delivery. And so when you think about the hybrid model, it has several key components. One is a local presence alongside the recipient of the service delivery, or the client, if you will. Another key component is a remote presence, often located in a location where there's access to technology resources, but a marketplace that provides a lower cost opportunity for delivery. So you can create that collaborative model, not to use our name in a sentence, but it's going to happen often, so I apologize up front. That model that allows multiple different teams to communicate frequently and fluidly. And that's especially important in certain types of service delivery work. So it's really all about interaction. That's the key. But it also does consider the fact that cost still matters. And so when you think about delivering services in a major metro marketplace, as an example, costs are typically high for resources in those markets. Nationally high in the U.S., but also globally high if you compare the U.S. to other marketplaces. If you look at some of the more rural locations or non-major metro, maybe tier 3 cities or even more less urban than that, you can get to a much more attractive cost profile because the cost of living is lower. You can still pay an attractive wage and attract people to the job, but the marketplace is less expensive to operate in, and therefore you create that cost balance between the two. When you think about it, what you need to consider are a strong local delivery capability, on-site with clients typically, but at least closely located. That tends to be very robust major metro type delivery. An off-site capability in that lower cost market that I spoke about. A robust training function, because in those lower cost markets, you may have strong IT skills, but they may not be in the technologies that the client desires. So you have to be able to work with the number of folks in that marketplace and train them on specific technologies that gets them closer to the problem. Also a specific, which also fosters a specific focus on services. So not trying to be all things to all people, but focus on those high-touch services that this model is best suited for. And also think about the balance between the two marketplaces of senior level skills to make sure that you maximize the opportunity both in the local market as well as the remote market. So it truly is a hybrid model, sort of waffling between a remote delivery model and an on-site delivery model, blending the two for an optimal result.
You know, John, one of the things that kind of immediately jumps out at me with regard to this slide, and maybe jumps out as the wrong term because it's all kind of located there together, but having worked in the offshore and outsourcing industry since the late 90s, I see some benefits here, you know, from clients that want to talk with the delivery team, and not just the front end to the delivery team, but to the team, in situations perhaps where the team needs to go to the client, and there's not a long wait for a visa or not a long, you know, a cultural kind of disconnect, and you're all co-located, and you can all be there together, but yet at the same time recognizing cost is still a huge priority for many clients. It looks like you're taking advantage of some non-urban centers to locate your folks, where you can get still enough critical mass of people to be able to effectively attract people and to support those clients.
You raise a great point, John, and we're going to talk about that in a few slides, that this really is about sort of a high collaboration model where it's easy to get back and forth between locations when the need arises, but you take advantage of a lower cost marketplace to really create the price point that makes it super attractive. Go to the next slide. So, and this is going to be a little bit of, and I apologize, a little bit of the master of the obvious statements made here, because I think anybody who's worked in an offshore model or a nearshore model understands some of the challenges. It's a great model for delivering work. I'm not trying to bash it. It certainly has its place, and a very significant place in IT services delivery here in the U.S. But there are challenges. And like I said, anybody who's been in the model understands those challenges. Accessibility is an issue, as we all know. Getting there is not easy. Getting resources from there, especially the other countries, to here is a challenge. The cost of that's not has to be factored in. There are certainly cultural differences and language differences, which combined really create less of a conversational model, more of a local presence to get requirements, and then an off-site presence to execute against those requirements type model. So not as much of a collaborative model as we would say is needed in some scenarios, but certainly effective one when you can pipeline work. In addition to that, there are security risks and IP risks. There are certain types of work. Certainly we do a lot of work with government, and in those scenarios, the offshore models just don't fit well. The nature of the work does not lend itself easily to that kind of model. And along with that, the time zone difference, probably the biggest difference that I mentioned last, which creates a big disparity in when the people are in the client location or in the location driving requirements are awake and available to work, and then when the people who are actually delivering against that work might be awake and available to have a conversation. Those time differences create a lot of strain when you need a high interaction model. Good for follow the sun, right? Everybody knows that. And if you can, again, pipeline the work, as I said earlier, that makes a lot of sense. But when you need to collaborate, that's more of a challenge.
Yeah, John, I think you're missing one bubble full of Z's, at the other end of it. From someone who's been there, done that, and been on both ends of that equation, it's just harder to do.
Yep, absolutely. You can go to the next slide. And now, John, I know that this is an area you've got a lot of expertise, the nearshoring area, which solves some of the problems, certainly. Bringing the proximity closer certainly begins to address the challenges, but I think still there are some substantial challenges that exist, and I wonder if you couldn't talk about that a bit, the pros and cons.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, near is nearer than offshore for sure. And when you think about the Americas, for most purposes, people are looking at Latin and South America, which have a mixed bag of skills and mixed bag of English language and even cultural frequency, or not frequency, but familiarity with the U.S. Once you get south of Mexico, scale becomes a problem in Latin America. Certainly Argentina and Brazil are interesting countries for a lot of folks. Brazil is kind of expensive. Argentina is dirt cheap, but the folks there typically consider themselves probably more aligned with Europe than the Americas. And so that can lead to some issues. I've seen some English language challenges as well. When you look at Mexico, there's really a northern Mexico and a southern Mexico. And southern Mexico, can tend to be a little bit more like the points in South America further south, whereas northern Mexico, unfortunately, where there is a lot of technology skill and familiarity with the U.S., they're running into a security perception problem now. And whether people should believe it or not, the perception is it's a dangerous place to work, and so that certainly doesn't help as well. So again, the model that you're bringing up, I think, becomes a next logical place to look. And as you said, for the work that that needs that high touch and interaction, it makes sense to keep it local in the U.S. You can go ahead and get to the next slide.
And so if you think about the areas that the model is intended to address, certainly language is a key element of this. Now, some people might say that the people in the East Coast don't speak the same language as the people in the Midwest, but I think arguably you can get through any accent differences and understand each other quite well. And I think all of the U.S. is pretty culturally aligned. I've lived and worked in a number of different places across the country, and there really aren't any significant disparities in the way that we communicate. So the nuances of language, the colloquialisms, et cetera, that make it easy to communicate one to another. I think those go away when it comes to sort of a full domestic model. And by the way, I think this model would carry anywhere in the world. If you think about any country doing IT work, we apply it to the U.S. because that's our marketplace. But I actually think you could lift this up and put it in any country or any region in the world, and the same principles would apply. Accessibility, again, it's a lot easier to get to our remote location. Happens to be in Wausau right now with a second one on the way, but a lot easier to get from Boston to Wausau than it is Boston to Chennai for a whole host of reasons, not to mention cost, distance, border security, et cetera. So accessibility is easy. As a matter of fact, we have a very fluid model, and I think others who see this model would understand that we have clients come out to the center all the time, and we have our people go to client sites all the time from the center. So it's a much more interactive model in that regard. A key aspect of I think what this accomplishes as well is a resource skill balance. So we understand that in some of the smaller marketplaces, and as we grow them, it'll become less of an issue, but certainly in small markets, you have diverse IT skills, but not as much IT skill. The balance that we have to that, and I think the balance this model provides, is an IT skill base in a major metro, which is significant. And if you look at the two together, you actually can scale to a pretty significant number relatively rapidly. You have to balance the scale requirement with the cost requirement, certainly, but it allows you to be much more flexible than if you were just purely major metro or purely what the marketplace calls rural sourcing or domestic sourcing. That's the key to this model, though. That's the hybrid in this hybrid approach. Again, security, IP risk, those kinds of things in the U.S. are less of an issue just because our laws protect us in those scenarios. And certainly the time zone that we talked about, the collaboration, the obvious one that I again leave till last in the conversation, is a big deal. And the fact that you're only 1 or 2 time zones away in any conversation makes a big difference. I think providers who do this in a way where they have a center of clients in a specific part of the country will tend to balance the work hours by 1 hour or maybe even 2 hours to align with that part of the country. If not, if you're in the Midwest, you're 1 or 2 hours reach from any location in the country. So the hybrid model creates that accessibility at a much more modified cost profile than if you were purely major metro, and in a different way than if you were internationally based or multinationally based.
John, I think that sounds like your secret sauce. I mean, not to overuse the cliche word, right skill, right price, right place, but you've got the right skills and talents in the right places where they need to be in order to deliver work, and you're effectively able to balance that with folks in more remote places who still have that same capability of being there on site, at a moment's notice as well.
That's exactly right, and I think that you absolutely hit it on the head. That's the secret sauce, if you will. And it's also a fluid model where you not only are constrained to one location. You don't set the model in place when you start the work and then never change it. The model can easily shift resource locations based on need. It becomes more of a high-touch scenario. You can shift the location to more of a local. If it becomes something that can be done more remotely with a little lower touch, you can shift it off to the remote location. It's really up to, it really is a requirement and cost balance.
Exactly.
Go to the next slide, please. We've talked a lot of the principles here, but I'll just run you through them really quickly. So the concept is you've got a team on the ground at a client site or somewhere near the client site, or the business group, or whoever the consumer of the service is. Those folks are typically responsible for the program management, for the high-touch parts of the engagement, to manage work activities across the client and the solutions team, and to work in close collaboration to ensure the result that is being produced meets the requirements of the consumer.
So John, I've done offshore, I've done nearshore, seems like forever and a day, and this is exactly what we did, these types of things. So how is this any different or any better than an offshore or nearshore model?
You bring up a great point, because it does. Certainly from this picture and from the high-level description, sound a lot like what most of the offshore providers and nearshore providers would say. I think the big difference is that those models are more of sort of a pack and ship model, where the people on site really package up the work and they ship it to the remote location. That remote location executes on the work. They ship it back, and then that work is passed back to the client, and hopefully we got it right all along the way. This model is more of a high collaboration model. So you have a lot of dialogue that goes on back and forth, not just between the on-site team and the off-site team, but the off-site team and the consumer of the service, or the client, if you will. There's a dialogue, a continuous dialogue. So in cases where you have not written everything down or everything's not perfectly clear, there's no need to translate and retranslate that through the intermediary or the on-site team. That's a direct conversation between the remote team and the client during working hours that make it a comfortable engagement model, and not during a 10 p.m. or 5 a.m. phone call. So I think the big difference here is the how and the when of the communication, and the style of the communication that makes things easier to understand more quickly with less pure longhand documentation, and at the same time facilitates a complete understanding between all parties.
Yeah, I think that complete understanding is key, right? We've probably all been involved in the Sev1 incident. Doesn't matter what time it is, wherever in the world, everybody's on the phone and everybody's fixing it. But that situation where a developer, I'm not quite sure I understand this requirement. Well, if it's 3 a.m. where your clients are, it's probably not a good idea to phone them up and go, what do you mean here? I've got this small piece of code that I need to interpret in some particular way. Whereas in this model, all of those little things that perhaps aren't big Sev1s, they don't get unresolved for 24 hours. They get resolved right away. And I think that's a key benefit as well.
That's exactly right. That's exactly. It's time to market. It's speed to delivery, speed of communication. So if you think about the off-site team, their focus is probably a pretty traditional list of things they need to accomplish. They're delivery focused, right? They're getting the job done in conjunction with the on-site team. They certainly manage their own activities amongst themselves, so that they need to have some independence. They certainly can travel as required, right? The idea is you keep them off-site. That's part of the profile and part of the cost management aspect of this, but there's no reason that they can't go on-site with clients as frequently as necessary. We have teams that have quarterly meetings on-site with the client just to keep that relationship fresh. And we have clients that actually travel out to the center as well. It's a very fluid model. And again, the key here is you use it to leverage the cost profile and the resource availability profile. We're finding more and more as we build this capability up, we've got great people available in those other markets, and that actually meets with some skill gaps we might have in the local market. So it's very much a balanced model. Next slide, please. Also through the continuum, the life cycle, if you will, of work, there's a very heavy usage of all resources as necessary through the life cycle. Even if you think about from strategy through support, there's no reason that the remote team can't be involved in strategy, although they tend to be less involved. And there's no reason, and quite frankly they often are, that the local team can't be involved in support, overseeing or managing or handling some aspects of it. So there's opportunity through the entire continuum to use resources, again, I say this all the time, at the right time, in the right place, for the right purpose.
A lot of times, John, I've seen it where the support team hasn't been involved at all, whether it's just a geographic necessity or whatever. And, in your model, it kind of lends itself to having some upfront representation even before things are built, even in the strategy phase, where, hey, we're going to get an idea of what's going to be coming our way. These aren't necessarily going to be the profiles of folks who are going to be laying out the architecture and the overall process and design of the project, but still having that knowledge and then being able to be involved in the execution and then obviously taking over support later on, I think also is another key differentiator that this model makes really easy and effective.
Absolutely right. And being able to use the local folks who may have been on early in the project in the support engagement creates a balance on the other end. Next slide, please. So John, I know this is your forte. You've seen as many models or more than most of us. Could you give us a little compare and contrast from your point of view of the various models and how this fits in?
Yeah, and when we look at all the Harvey balls here, it's kind of obvious those first 5 things, right? Business user interaction. Of course, it's going to happen when you're there, and a little harder when you're not. High complex system requirements. Stuff that requires a lot of interaction, and let's be sure that it's understood. Again, if you're on site and you're there, that's important so that you make sure you don't have those miscues. Integration with the on-site team, hard to do when you're offshore, easier to do when you're there. And this is one where in the hybrid on-site model, I think you have the right mix here. Do we have to have everybody on site all the time at the client? No. But the fact that these guys are all, again, same country, same language, same time zone or close time zone, they're in frequent communication. So those folks, and there's also the opportunity to have clients visit and for the team to visit. So that integration aspect, which is key when things get tough, having that team integrated is a very strong point. And I think, your model lends itself to that. Agile methodology, I think that speaks for itself. It's, the daily scrums, the sprints, all of this stuff. You really need to be there to make it work. It's just so much harder to do offshore. Not impossible, but a lot harder. And again, aggressive time to market, that kind of goes back to making sure we understand what we're building. It may be cheaper to do it twice offshore, but if I think from a cycle time reduction or, let's just get this thing out the door, I'm going to be able to do that the more folks that I have co-located with the clients. If we're budget constrained, obviously offshoring makes a whole lot of sense, whereas on-site is typically, the complete opposite. That's the most expensive solution. And I think your model bridges that in an interesting way, right? You've got on-site people where you need them, but then you also have folks in, again, non-urban locations or maybe smaller city locations, so that you're able to effectively address that cost element. And internal team effort and constraints. I remember my first offshore project being on conference calls 7 a.m., 7 p.m., talking way into the night, getting up early to handle the project, and it wasn't fun. And it was, after 2 or 3 months of that, I've seen many instances where service providers have personnel that leave, where clients have personnel that leave, just from the effort that's required in many cases, not all, but in many cases, to make the model work. And certainly, when you're having to explain things like that, if you're onshore or your client team has their day job that they're also supposed to be engaged in, it just makes it a lot harder to do. And then if you look at the large scale things, sure, offshore is going to be good from the perspective of lots of people and lower costs. Harder to get a whole bunch of people on site. Again, I've seen many situations where clients didn't have the physical space to cram people into their offices. So again, I think the hybrid model here is a very interesting and effective way of addressing this as well. So I know we want to hurry up and get into the case study, so why don't we go to the next slide here. And we've got, I'm sorry, yeah, our poll. So we've been talking about different models here. It would be interesting to hear from you guys that are on the phone or on the web here. What outsourcing model does your company use? And if you would, just go ahead and make a selection, and we'll tabulate that. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to select either an offshore, a nearshore, all onshore, or we don't do this. All right, and we do have the results here. So as one might expect, 78% of our responses are saying offshore, 11% nearshore, and 11% onshore, and nobody is not outsourcing. Yep. So pretty interesting. Pretty heavily involved in offshoring.
Not surprising, but I think you're going to see nearshoring and onshoring growing significantly. They have already. 11% is a much bigger share than they had just a few years ago. You'll see those growing quite a bit over the next couple of years. And I know we do want to get to the case study, so I'm not going to belabor the lessons too much here. We're running a little short on time. But we certainly have learned a lot in our 3 years or so in this model. We used to have a totally local model, and now we've gone to this model and seen great growth, but we've also seen things that we can improve. Communication is critical for success. I know we talk about this as a high communication model, but you have to be properly prepared to communicate. You have to have tools in place. You have to facilitate that communication and foster it. Let people know, because a lot of folks are used to the offshore model, that that's an open dialogue that we need to have in order to really take advantage of the model and create maximum value. Managing a diverse skilled staff takes a different approach. So these other markets, non-major metro, might be steeped in technologies that are not necessarily the ones that you find in major metros. You find RPG as an example, or mainframe programmers, folks with great IT skills that just simply need to be sort of brought up to date with some of the major metro technologies, but they have a diverse skill set to draw from. So instead of being a 10-year Java programmer, they might have done DBA work, they might have done programming work, they might have done SharePoint support, and you need to understand and take advantage of that skill profile. Direct communication between client and remote personnel will be frequent. Open the channel because it's a huge positive to the model. The ramp-up of personnel, though, on new technologies needs to be accounted for in the plan. So if you do happen to be in a marketplace where the strength is not in Drupal, let's say, relatively new technology in the content management space, you need to make sure you account for that and ramp resources up accordingly and just make sure it's counted for in the plan. The way we do it, and I think the way this model will do it in general, is you have strong resources working with resources that may be new to the technology to essentially raise their skill level as quickly as possible along with training programs. And we've found that you can accelerate a good technologist into a new technology very rapidly by using a mentoring type of a model. Clients, it's a new model, relatively speaking, although it has a lot of old fundamentals to it. So I think from a consumer perspective, it's good that we educate people on how the model works and how to take best advantage of it. But no matter what, onboarding into a model the first time is always a challenge, especially if it's a new provider in the model, so account for that as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of these things are things that we would see in an offshore model as well, right? I just can only imagine how much easier and more effective it is with people that are closely located to your actual clients.
Yep, absolutely. Next slide.
I think we have a poll question now that should be popping up on everyone's screen. So for those of you who have used perhaps a combination of models, with which have you had the greatest success? Offshore, nearshore, onshore, or again, I don't use any of these. It sounds like that shouldn't be a selection for anyone on the phone, so we'll wait a few seconds here. So where have you had the greatest success if you've used more than one model? And sounds like everyone who said offshore before said offshore again. 78% with offshore and 22% with nearshore. So, probably could have defined what success was before, somewhat to perhaps, be able to better understand the answers here. But, everyone that was before had said onshore. It sounds like maybe these guys have lumped things in with nearshore. So, and that's perhaps to be expected as well, right? The offshore model certainly has continued to mature, and the tools and techniques that are used by many offshore providers, a lot of the things we're talking about, they've seen before, and they've worked very diligently at trying to address those. So that's not a surprise. That said, the first meeting that I had with a group that I was working with in Thailand when we were finally all face-to-face was, this is just so much easier talking to you in person rather than, on Skype or IM or, using any of the other collaboration tools. It's just easier to be co-located. So, enough of the kind of explaining the model and all of that stuff. I think it would be worthwhile if we go ahead and jump into the case study. And Arun, are you ready to go?
Yes. So we work with analog devices, and Scott was the eBusiness director, and he will walk us through the, he will tell us about what analog does and what his business problem was and what he was looking for us to solve. Next slide.
So Analog Devices is a Fortune 500 electronics company. We were founded in 1965 by two MIT graduates, and in fact, one of those graduates is still the chairperson of the chairman of the board. We are involved in real-world signal processing. So when you think about that, sight, sound, touch, we take those sort of signals and transmit them to digital. So the converter market, which is just one kind of product type market we're in is we're one of the largest. We are actually the largest player in the market, at about 40% of the market, but we're in a lot of different product type markets. And when you think about, really in every industry you can think of, in healthcare, industrial and instrumentation, military and aerospace, the consumer market, we have roughly 50,000 orderable products that really, again, span the gamut of, sensing technologies. When you look at our customer base, we have customers. We have about 60,000 customers. We have some of the largest customers that you can think of, seems of the world, a lot of the automotive market. We have a good foothold with most major auto suppliers, and we're really servicing every country around the world. We certainly have a big focus in the Asia-Pacific market, and especially China. We've seen a tremendous growth in China over the last 5 years, especially. But we still have, roughly even distribution in U.S., Euro, and Asia-Pac. We do about $3 billion in revenue per year, and see some very strong growth ahead. If you want to go to the next slide, please. So when we talk about the fact that we're in a lot of different markets, product markets, and the technologies that we implement are extremely complex. When you select a technology, a sensing technology, a converter, what have you, you may be looking at 50 to 75 different parameters. And that technology that you're implementing is really just one chip on a very large circuit board, potentially. And so you really have to understand how that chip, how that technology is going to interact with that sensing, with that conversion, with amplification, what have you. And so getting products and product selection to customers in a really simplified and powerful form is very important to us. In addition to that, we really are looking for as many what we call parts per opportunity with a certain vendor, or with a certain customer. And so we're really looking to gain more traction with customers. So when we looked at what we're trying to do here, a lot of what we do is with our online presence. So you don't think of a B2B like Analog Devices as having a very complex web presence, but we do. We have a site with about 400,000 URLs. A lot of that has to do with the amount of products we have, but also the fact that product selection is a very complex process. And the fact of the matter is, too, that customers, from the original design inception to ultimate production release, we see lead time somewhere from 12 to 18 months by the first time we've had contact from a customer, whether it be through sales or through our online presence, to when we see production volumes happening. So that goes to the complexity of that selection process. And so we engage with collaborative and a fairly large initiative to really create new product selection tools. And we really wanted to help mid-market engineers specifically. Those are the engineers that do not necessarily get called on directly from our field sales engineers. They tend to be smaller customers, although we do look to attract the bigger customers through our online presence as well to select products. So we really wanted to promote new sales that way. And again, we want to make product selection as easy as possible. The easier we make that product selection, the more confidence that we give customers that we have the right products and those products are going to perform. The belief is that we're going to gain larger market share in other markets outside of converters. When we look at the key features of what we're looking to implement, we really needed a highly dynamic graphical user interface. We wanted to make sure that product information could be accessed in the context of what they were doing. When you look at, again, selecting a product, data sheet is one of the most commonly looked at pieces of collateral. But there's also a lot of other collateral will go around the products, like symbols and footprints and other schematic drawings, those sort of things. So it's really key that we give them those right pieces of information. Again, we want to make sure that we have easy ordering as part of the process, albeit, when we go through that, an engineer goes through the process, that original order may be for just prototyping, but we want to make sure that receive those products in a very short amount of time and make it very easy to order those products. When we look at the development challenges, it really was a system that we saw as incredibly complex. And there wasn't a lot of precedent for what we were doing. It's a very complex subject matter, especially I've been at Analog for 15 years. I'm not an electrical engineer by trade, so sometimes I even find it challenging. So collaborative coming on, I think as they came on, they got up to speed fairly quickly, and what something was very difficult. We have a lot of internal systems to deal with. In fact, our public web presence, when you look behind the scenes of it, there's 30-plus systems involved in the construction of that system. The other piece of this is, we're a global company. We expect every interaction to take place in less than 4 seconds, even in China. And so that's kind of our benchmark there. And so we had, I'd say, is a pretty big challenge ahead of us. And the reason why we selected collaborative in this nearshore model was, the fact that we knew we had these challenges ahead of us. We work heavily in offshoring, but we wanted to look at this as a really first foray into this model. We thought for the time to market challenges we had, we thought it would be the best selection. So you go to the next slide, please. So when we look at, again, what we were trying to achieve, we really had 3 tenets that we were looking at, and one was quality. When we look at our customers and what they expect from us, of course they expect high quality. When we look at our products, errors are measured in parts per million, in the single digits parts per million. And so when we look at our web presence or anything we offer to the customer, we want to really have that same sort of quality. If we can't provide a quality web presence, quality product selection, how can they expect us to have quality products? And so again, we really needed what we were doing, knowing it was complex, that it needed to be high quality. We wanted to make sure we had the right partner to work with. Of course, like everyone else, well, the web group is pretty well funded. Costs are very constrained, and there's always more work to do than we have dollars for. So we really have to look for, I think, innovative models to balance costs across offshore, nearshore, and our own employees. And so we had a fairly tight budget considering what we were trying to do. And as we looked at all the alternatives to control costs, again, we felt like this was really the best one to do that. Now, when we looked at speed, again, you can do things in an offshore model, which we've been doing for 10 years, and one of the things that we certainly have recognized is it's not the fastest time to market by far. There are a lot of challenges, as has been described before, and we've run into most, if not all, of those challenges. And so in this case, we had a deadline for the Electronica trade show to have a system up and running, these product selection tools up and running. And so we knew time was of the essence. And again, knowing that this nearshore model would be a great deal faster than the offshore model, we felt a lot of confidence that we would be able to deliver, and did deliver, actually, in time for that Electronica trade show. Next slide.
Okay. So Scott, thanks for explaining the business problem, and we had a mobile deadline, which was the Electronica show. So we had a little bit of crunch mode. So I'll just walk you through the things that we did and delivered the the system to the client at meeting all the 3 goals that they had set together. One was quality, cost, and the budget. So when we met with the client, which is Scott's client, which is the business partner of Scott. So when we met and we discussed what the business problem was, he walked us through the basic concept of the application. He then provided us the overall expectation and the timeline. And he also mentioned that the Analog has done this in the past, and they had they were far from successful implementing the product selection. So we were up for the challenge. We understood the problem domain. We broke it down in pieces where everything was high-risk items were identified up front. We leveraged the onshore, the remote team for providing some of the proof of concepts, and allowed us to work together and helped us deliver the product. We actually used a agile process. Since the team was only one zone apart, we never had any issues, walking up with some, there was never a situation where we had to wake up somebody in the middle of the night, as John had mentioned with his, previous experiences working with offshore. The local as well as the remote resources on the project, they definitely had some skills gap, but we worked with as a team and made sure that the gaps were filled up. One of the key important things that we realized that communication was important, whether the team is offshore, onshore, or nearshore, and we made sure that the communication pieces, the tools were selected properly, and ultimately we were able to work with the client and made sure that any gaps in the requirement were identified. We didn't have to wait until next day or so to get those requirements clarification, as John mentioned. Another advantage that we had with the agile process is we did not document up to the nth degree. We had, we picked up enough information that we were able to work with it and keep on continuing working with the product. The 2-week cycle allowed us to take the input from the client and implement it and show it to the client. And a continuous feedback mechanism really helped us. Granted that you could do that, with the offshore model too, but having the team just one time zone apart really helped us, work together and deliver the product that the client wanted. So ultimately, we were able to finish the product, deliver the product during on Electronica on time, where we got all the feedback, and we are still continuing to develop and enhance the product. Next slide, please. So as with the nearshore team, there are some of the intangibles that that we saw. One of them where nobody had to spend or wake up in the middle of the night to get that phone call, and that you must have experienced working with the offshore team. We used the application development services, the business analysis services, the QA services, and the project and program management services from the collaborative, out of which the QA and the application development were done in a hybrid model, because that's the right model that Analog was looking for, and we helped them in a place where they needed. The overall team was about more than 50 people, with a combination of CDSC and local team. We worked the heavy lifting, or we had to work with several Analog local teams, so the local team helped us do that. We had several occasions where we had to fly in people from CDSC to help during the deployment. So, and again, there was no visa requirement, and they could just fly the next day, and it really made the entire development process or the entire project process easy. The application was using all the latest and greatest technologies. So the areas where where we had to fill in the skills gap, the team here was able to do the work. And at the end of the project, the entire team is on par with the local team, and they are ready to handle new challenges. Next slide, please. So we are up for the challenges. We delivered the impossible. We delivered a very complex system at a low cost and at the time which the client wanted. The Analog was delighted with the outcome, and it really simplified the overall product selection process for Analog's customers, and the system is live, and it's either meeting or beating its original business objectives. So Scott, how was the final experience, and what was the feedback from your customers?
Yeah, I mean, I think the final experience was great, and I mean, one of the best ways to tell that is the fact that we continue to work with collaborative in this model, in the same space. This was a massive project that really didn't have an end. We're continuing on with evolving it and continuing on with collaborative in the same way, because we've been so happy. In fact, we're looking at undertaking some new opportunities with collaboratives. So I'd say that it's the best way to say that it works. In fact, we keep going with it.
All right, thanks, Scott. Thanks for the kind words. John, I think we described the case study. If anybody has any questions or.
Yeah, I'll have a look at some of the questions that are coming in, and here's the first one. What differentiates this model from what the big providers like Accenture and IBM would offer?
Well, I think
John
that's
Williams, you want to take that?
yeah, sure. I think that's a very good question. I think one of the challenges that the big providers may have is they're big. Sounds kind of obvious, but they need large markets with lots of people in order to meet their financial demands. So locating in places that are very comfortable for a company of our size, where we try to build centers of 200 people or so, and just add more centers as opposed to try to get to large populations where we can put 1,000, 2,000 people in a center, gives us a distinct, or gives this model certainly a distinct cost advantage from the remote location perspective. You can get great people. It's a great cost of living market, and the cost balance is there, if you will, because most of our costs are in salary. I don't think you see the same in the big providers. I'll tell you though, every single one of them that I'm aware of are creating a middle ground model much like this, where they're trying to create this onshore capability that is a complement to their offshore capability and a local large market capability. I just think the markets we operate in are ones that have a bit of an advantage from a cost perspective.
And I guess you guys are probably a first mover in a lot of these markets as well.
Yeah, I think I mean, from our understanding, we were early entry in the market. We're 3 years in. A lot of people are just scratching the surface now.
Right. So, folks in the audience, again, if you do have a question, please click on the buttons on the screen and go ahead and submit it. Here's another one that just popped in. So, what specific types of services would you see best being addressed in this model?
As we said earlier, it's really high-touch service-centric. So, things like business intelligence is a great example, where you've got a lot of work going on, dialogue going on between the creators of the reports and the business users. Far too often we see, a report specification be created, it gets handed off to someone who develops it, and they hand it back, and the user says, well, that's not really what I wanted. Because it's really hard to specify a report, because reports are very dynamic. There's a lot of interaction in a report. Reports aren't static anymore, especially dashboards and things like that. That's one example. I think that the example here we spoke about, ADI, where you've got a very aggressive time to market. You've got a very collaborative team, using our name in a sentence again, on the client side that has a lot of direct input. You've got almost a prototyping mentality to creating the site because it is so new and because it is so innovative. I think those are great examples. So I think anywhere you see a need for the team to actively interact and dialogue during that development effort and even beyond, it's a great fit for this model.
So here's a question I guess I have, John. What's the difference between this model and maybe an India pure play trying to come into the U.S. and open up a shop in the U.S.?
Well, I think the India pure plays, if they're and they are starting to, I've seen a lot of movement in that regard as well. I think they're very smart. They're large companies, very successful companies. I think what they see is there is an opening in the market here where we're having a local U.S.-based presence is key. As a matter of fact, I know that one large India firm opened up in Gainesville, Georgia. Gainesville, Florida. I apologize, wrong state. So I think that they'll probably approach it, or at least from what I've seen, a little differently than we have, in that we've got a very strong, or I think the strength of this model in general, people who adopt it, is strong major metro presence, balanced with a remote presence. The two together are the key, and I think until you fill all those holes, it's going to be it's going to be a different model that we put forward. And again, we're not in the major markets. We have a little different cost profile, I think, at least for the local resourcing. But I'm sure that the large companies are coming into this marketplace and setting up similar capabilities. The other thing I'd say that, and we focus on this as well, is the smaller companies like ours will focus on specific things they do best. Try to become best in breed in niche spaces as opposed to try to solve all problems. I know for us it's BI, it's application development, mainly custom web apps, and SharePoint's another big play for us. But we don't try to be all things to all people. We don't do SAP and other things. I think companies that are of our scale who are successful in this model will be focused and levered to the small markets.
All right. Any more questions from anyone else? And I guess just a couple of seconds here. It doesn't look like we have any others, so I would like to thank John Williams from Collaborative and Arun, also from Collaborative, for sharing an explanation of the model and a real-world example, and always Scott Rosa. It's always important to have a client on the phone who can certainly validate and share with the crowd just how the model has worked. Again, I'm John Butler with ISG. Thank you all very much for speaking. Thank you all very much for attending, and hope you have a great rest of the day. And we'll see you at the next OI webinar.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.